Hello, and thanks, Mike. And everyone else, thank you for attending this presentation on my book, 6 Days in September, a novel of Lee's Army in Maryland in 1862. I'd like to thank Mike Movius and the Civil War Roundtable Congress for inviting me to speak to you today. It's really a rare honor. As a formerly trained historian who occasionally writes narrative fiction, I've never been asked to address a Civil War Roundtable concerning this work, so it's really an important event for me. As you can see from my title slide here, I'm going to offer some ideas concerning my work, writing what I call novelized history about the Maryland campaign of 1862. Some of the ideas I present will no doubt prove provocative to those of you who think in highly structured ways about the differences between historical fiction and formal history. But this is the reason behind my calling the work an experiment, because it's just as much an experimental approach for me as it probably will be to you. My hope is to gently challenge the strict separation between narrative fiction and formal history by describing how taking a novelized approach can potentially provide insight into historical events, insight that might enable us to achieve a better understanding of the history, and by encouraging us to imagine what it would have been like behind Confederate lines at Sharpsburg in 1862. So to me, simply having events described in a straightforward historical narrative can get us part of the way there. But I believe that if it's done correctly, reading about the events in a novelized form can add a deeper element of understanding that enriches our appreciation of those events and stays with us long after we've turned the final page. So with that, let's get started. So what is 6 Days in September? It's a novelized history of the last 6 days of the 1862 Confederate campaign in Maryland, written exclusively from the perspective of the rebel army and from local Marylanders. So how can a novel be history, you might ask? Well, we've become very formal in our differentiation between history and historical fiction. According to the formal definition of the word history, it can be a branch of knowledge dealing with the past events, a continuous systematic narrative of past events relating to a specific subject area, or a drama representing historical events. You'll notice that none of the versions of the definition that I just gave you said history needs to be written in the third person or that it requires documentary sourcing. Adding foot or end notes was developed in the 19th century when historians tried to make their craft systematic by linking their writing to the sources they were using. Notes, etc., are therefore a sign of history's professionalization and subsequent transformation into the practice that we know today. You'll probably have noticed by now the small h on the slide at the in front of the word history. I'd like to ask you to think of my use of the term history in the way that people often use a capitalized form of a word to describe, say, their religious or political affiliations. So fully committed believers might call themselves capital C Christians, for instance, or capital D Democrats, or capital R Republicans, to reflect the depth of their conviction. I'm using the term history here in the same way. But I can't put that in the title of a book because it would be too confusing. But in the context of this presentation, I can explain my approach. And I'll be talking more about this subject in the slides to come. So why focus on the last 6 days of the campaign? Well, the book covers the dates from September 13th through September 19th, 1862, which is basically the week when Robert E. Lee's plans in Maryland went from the heights of success to the depths of disappointment and failure and defeat. It's one of the war's most pivotal periods, filled with tension and high drama and momentous events. I wanted to capture that sense of things by focusing on that critical week. Concerning the narrow perspective only on the rebel side, and then on some local Marylanders who were involved as well, I wanted to try something different here when it came to exploring the Maryland campaign. Joseph Harsh, in his book Taken at the Flood, had written a history of the campaign exclusively from the Confederate perspective, and Ethan Rafuse had done relatively the same from the Union side of the story, although with a larger study of George McClellan. So I figured, why couldn't a novel take the same approach? When writing, I also found that focusing on only one side of the story really enabled me to present things more from that side's perspective. It offered a way to make the picture more complete. And then there are, of course, politics to consider. Some people really don't want to read about Yankees. Others don't want to read about rebels. So I figured, why not give them the chance to satisfy their prejudices by splitting the story into two books. That way, if you want to read one, you can read one. If you want to read the other, you can read the other. Never the twain shall meet. But if you want to read both, then you'll get a picture of things from both sides. In the Confederate case, there's also a matter of historical memory to contend with. The deeper one digs into the history of the Maryland campaign in general, the more one comes to realize that the presence of secessionist sentiment and the secessionists themselves has either been lost or actively purged from public memory in Maryland. It doesn't help that at Antietam, there are only a small handful of monuments dedicated to the memory of Southern units, while there are monuments to Northern units can be found in the dozens. And clearly there was something about Sharpsburg that Southern states had failed to commemorate after the war, whereas they had spent copious amounts of money erecting statues and placing tablets on the field at Gettysburg. I'm not judging this as good or bad. I'm only saying that the situation exists. And if anything, then the memory of Southern sacrifice at Sharpsburg could use a boost, I thought. After all, you can't have a battle with only one combatant. Concerning the lost memory of secessionist sentiment, allow me to provide a few examples. Back when the National Cemetery on Cemetery Hill was being created after the war, there once stood a large boulder there referred to as Lee's Rock. Some of you may know this story. Legend had it that the general had stood upon it while watching the fighting on September 17th, but there's no evidence that he actually did. Nevertheless, planners of the cemetery didn't want anything associated with Lee within the boundaries of their grounds, so they had the rock broken up and scattered. Then there's the story of Sevilla Miller, which a few of you might know, be more familiar with. A member of a pro-secessionist family in Sharpsburg, Miller stood on her front porch all day on September 17th, providing water to Lee's men. Her house stood at the western base of Cemetery Hill, which was a very dangerous place for Sevilla to be during the battle. Federal artillerists firing from the eastern side of Antietam Creek continuously overshot rebel gun positions on Cemetery Hill. That shot and shell fire fell behind the hill in Sharpsburg, right where Miller's house stood. So in other words, a local woman holding unpopular political convictions and sympathies offered comfort to Southern soldiers while under fire all day on September 17th. And what happened to her house after the war? Well, at some point it was demolished, leaving an empty lot today. For many years, a gas station stood on the spot in town, which I'm sure those of you familiar with Sharpsburg will remember. But I ask you now to compare the story of Sevilla Miller with that of Teresa Kretzer, who lived only a few doors down from Miller. Kretzer has been called the bravest girl in Sharpsburg for daring to display Old Glory when rebel troops occupied the town. Eventually, she took down the flag and hid it in the ashes of her family's smokehouse. She then rode out the battle hunkered down in the cellar of her Fieldstone home. That house has a plaque on it today. It remains standing in town, commemorating Teresa's defiance while Miller's house is long forgotten. So the story of Sevilla Miller and others in town made me realize that no one had really captured the experience of that portion of the population in Sharpsburg which welcomed Lee's army when it arrived. I thought their story should be told along with that of rebel troops because it hadn't been told and it was in danger of being completely forgotten. And besides, I thought it was a really interesting story. Concerning the main elements of the narrative, what the book really entails is it details Lee's decision-making process throughout the period of those 6 days when his campaign went awry and all his plans went awry. So I really dive into that very deeply. It also puts the readers in the shoes of the fighting men in the Army of Northern Virginia. So it gives you a really ground's eye view of what it was like to be in the Army of Northern Virginia and to fight at the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg. And then also, I wanted to set Sharpsburg in the context of the military campaign by combining subjects of local and military interest. So I did a bunch of research on the history of locals, and especially a few that I focus on that I will be coming to, or that I'll expand on in a bit. So now why the six days in September? So why a narrative fiction approach and not history? Well, there are several reasons for that, which I'll lay out here and expand on later in the presentation. The first is really uniqueness. Multiple formal, what I like to call capital H histories already exist, and others are on the way, like the new volume on Antietam that Scott Hartwig is writing, excuse me. So I'm trying to accomplish something different here, though, by writing what I call small H history, which is why I've referred to this work as my experiment. Interested in awareness of the importance of the event or the clash at Sharpsburg is also a really important reason why I decided to write this. A kind of playful rivalry exists in Civil War studies between those who see the Battle of Gettysburg as a major turning point in the conflict and those who give the honor to the earlier fight in Maryland. So as you might expect, I tend to view the latter as the more consequential of the two events for a number of reasons that we can go into if you'd like. But at the moment, let me just say, I don't have much use for the phrase turning point. I prefer to use Winston Churchill's term concerning the Battle of Britain and think of Antietam as the end of the beginning for the Confederacy. It was the occasion when she took her best shot and fell short. Almost 3 bloody years of war remained to be fought before it would be all over, but for a variety of reasons, the South would never again come as close to achieving its independence. So it's because of that outcome and the long-term negative impact that losing the battle had for the South that I've long thought Antietam deserved to have its own killer angels, and I just hope that I've been able to provide it. The third reason is really the importance of the fight, awareness of the importance of the fight at Sharpsburg. It motivated me to want to reach a wider audience of blasphemers and heretics who don't like to read capital H history. And we know who you folks are, right? Everyone knows somebody like that. And I'm joking, of course, but consider the fact that while many of you who only read history won't pick up a work of fiction no matter how closely sourced it is, there are even more people out there who won't read history. They may find the subject interesting, but they just can't bring themselves to read something with tiny text at the bottom of the page or an entire section of endnotes at the back. So I'm trying to reach that audience as well as those people who do like to read history. The other reason would be to explore the experience of the townspeople at the same time as events on the field. Hundreds, if not thousands of people experienced the descent of Lee's army on the area around Sharpsburg, and they also experienced the fear that came with the arrival of the war and the falling of shells in town. And I wanted to capture their experience in the context of the Confederate occupation and explore the critical role played by certain locations in the village, like the house of Dr. Jacob Grove on the main square, which is pictured in the drawing on the right at top, and St. Paul's Episcopal Church, which is pictured at the right on the bottom, which is down the road a bit to the west. And by combining these local experiences with the military action, it's not something that one usually does in a big H history of the war or capital H history of the conflict, but it fits well within a novelized setting. So I wanted to explore that angle. And then finally, I wanted to achieve what I think we all really want when we read history, and that's to get inside the events by exploring what Lee and other participants might have been doing or thinking at critical points. And I'll explain this more on the next slide, but right now, let me see that the key to doing this is the right way is rigor. And here's where the historian in me comes out. I believe that no matter the format, the events need to be portrayed as accurately as possible and in their proper order. See, I'm not writing Kafka here. No one wakes up to find themselves transformed into an insect, and readers never experience huge jumps in time. Some events do overlap, and that can't be helped. But to me, it's the perspective and how the events are described that matter. As you read 6 Days in September, you'll know only what the people in the story knew at the time. There's no omniscient voice writing over the experience in the narrative. And I think this in-the-moment approach allows a reader to dive more into the events themselves by creating a kind of fog of war effect that keeps events unfolding as he or she encounters them. And unfolding events, in my experience, keep pages turning. So now about novelized history versus history. If I listen closely, I can already hear objections about this. So what's the difference between the two? I've gone into it a bit, but let me explain things in a different way. In my opinion, formally written history, and that's the big H history I keep referring to, has limitations that its novelized counterpart doesn't. Think back to the comments that I made at the beginning of this talk about how history evolved as a profession in the 19th century. As a result of it, historians today build their work on the citation of facts and then use those facts to interpret what happened. They document sources and muster them like an army to achieve their objective of telling the story, hopefully as accurately as possible. They then argue with other historians about those interpretations, or sometimes they even argue about the underlying facts. So let's explore an example from the Maryland campaign. When his army was camped near Frederick, Maryland, did Robert E. Lee know that President Lincoln had asked George McClellan to reassume command of the Army of the Potomac? Some historians say that Lee didn't know, even though one historical source says that he did. And that would be what was written by John G. Walker after the war. Faced with this fact, because it's something written, right? Questions began to revolve around the trustworthiness of the source. And I won't go into all that debate, but you get the picture about the facts, that historians argue all the time about what really happened versus what didn't, and whether the facts actually capture the reality or whether they don't. Facts, in other words, can be fluid things. But let's leave all that aside for the moment and assume that the basic facts are established and agreed upon. My job as a writer of novelized history is to build on those facts by exploring the gaps that exist between them. None of us can get inside of the minds of our spouses or friends or coworkers, much less the minds of historical figures who lived, hundreds of years ago. That limitation, in addition to the lack of documentary evidence for many events, creates gaps in our understanding of the past. And I think those gaps are important because they often contain the information that we most want to know. So unlike big H history or capital H history, novelized history allows for an explanation or exploration of the gaps by using the facts to establish the narrative skeleton. So an author writing small h history can then delve into the experience and explore it. The important thing that I'm trying to do is to remain in the realm of the plausible by writing only what makes sense within the context of the situation. When I write about Robert E. Lee standing on Cemetery Hill watching his men stream back from broken lines in the East Woods, for example, I don't have him thinking about his former estate at Arlington or what he wants for supper. There are more pressing matters at hand, and those are the ones that need to be discussed. So those who don't read fiction at all might object to even this measured and careful approach. And I've heard those objections over the year from many readers of capital H history. For example, some of them have told me that they don't want to read something that gets them confused about what happened or what didn't happen. And so see my comments on the fluidity of facts mentioned above for an opinion on that. Others have said that they only read what the documented sources want to say. Some have come right out and stated they don't want to read anything that's made up. That's fair enough. There are some subjects I don't want to read about in fictional accounts either. The other objections I can't relate to. If one doesn't want to be confused, then one can read standard histories of the events. And then with a firm knowledge of those, they can still enjoy 6 Days in September and see how its approach differs without developing any cognitive dissonance about the history, so to speak. My work is intended to educate and spur interest in the history. I want people to go out and buy Tom Clemens's edited Edward Ezra Carman manuscript and Harshness Taken at the Flood and Hartwig's To Antietam Creek, to name just a few studies of the Maryland campaign. Perhaps an example here would best make my point. So I'd like to read a short excerpt from another book I've written, not published yet, tentatively titled Their Maryland, Rebel Dreams, Aspirations, and Failure in September of 1862. The manuscript's with Savas Beatty right now, and it contains 7 essays that examine critical issues in the Confederate history of the campaign. This excerpt really deals with the arrival of Stonewall Jackson in Sharpsburg on the morning of September 16th, and it's straightforward, standard capital H history. So Daybreak on September 16th brought the arrival of a portion of Stonewall Jackson's victorious command from Harper's Ferry. His 10,300 troops commenced crossing the Potomac while Jackson himself rode ahead to meet with General Lee and announce the arrival of his command. Finding Lee and Longstreet standing in the fog atop Cemetery Hill, Jackson spoke with the two men for a time. What passed between them has been lost to history, although from a post-war comment written by Lee in a letter to Jackson's widow, it appears that they discussed the Army's situation at that moment, including Lee's reasons for electing to fight in Maryland. To quote the letter itself, and I quote, "When he, Jackson, came upon the field, having preceded his troops and learned my reasons for offering battle, he emphatically concurred with me." This is all that Lee wrote, and it leaves us with a tantalizing question mark. What did Jackson say at such an important moment? Here's a good example then of our being confronted by a gap in the facts. So now let me offer how I wrote about the event in the same event in 6 Days in September and give you an idea of the differences. So Lee spied Stonewall approaching, calling out, "Ah, General Jackson is here." Nodding at his commanding officer, Jackson offered a short salute, as did General Walker, whom Lee also greeted. Then Jackson acknowledged the greetings of others with a quick nod and offered a thin smile in the direction of his brother-in-law, Daniel Harvey Hill. "Congratulations on your victory, General," said Lee with more warmth than was customary. Jackson looked almost embarrassed by the praise. "The Almighty is responsible," he grumbled. "He blessed us with a great triumph." "Indeed," agreed Lee. "Now tell me, General, where is your command?" Jackson tilted his head in the direction he had just come. "Jones's and Lawton's divisions are crossing the river as we speak. Walker's men are close behind them." The hill remains at the ferry with paroling prisoners and securing the materiel we captured. And McLaws, asked Longstreet. The stout Georgian led a division in Old Pete's wing of the army, and Longstreet worried about its prolonged separation. Jackson turned in Longstreet's direction. In Pleasant Valley, but his orders are to cross to Virginia as quickly as possible and to meet us here. Was there no way to expedite his movement, asked Lee. We need every man just now. Jackson shook his head. No, sir. The ferry is a small place with crowded with prisoners. McLaws' command is spread across the valley from South Mountain to the summit of the heights in Maryland. He is in an unwieldy position. Lee studied Jackson, contemplating his brief report. Then it seems there's nothing to do but wait, he sighed. I'm sure he will be along soon. Jackson gazed around him at the fog, asking, what of the enemy, General Lee? Where is he? The enemy is before us in strength, occupying ground on the far side of Antietam Creek, volunteered Harvey Hill, pointing to the east. I can't see anything through this mist, observed Walker. The fog is breaking, General, and beyond it the hills are thick with enemy guns, grumbled Longstreet. You'll see them soon enough. Do you expect McClellan to attack today? Inquired Jackson, scratching at his beard. Lee shook his head. No, I believe there is still time for us to prepare. Jackson studied what he could of the landscape. It appears to be decent ground for a fight, sir. At that moment, Longstreet cleared his throat. Sir, may I speak with you and General Jackson in private, he asked Lee. The Army commander agreed, and the three men stepped away from the others. His voice low, Longstreet leaned in close. Jackson, this is a perilous position, he began. The Army is divided, exhausted, and straggling has been heavy in every division. Nodding in agreement, Jackson listened on. The enemy is here in great number, and there is not as much ground here for maneuver as first appears. We have but a single line of retreat behind us and a single ford over which to do it. I believe we should pull back across the river and defend it against the Yankees while we rest and reorganize. Jackson remained silent, his tightly drawn cap shielding his eyes. General Longstreet and I have discussed these matters at length, said Lee with some impatience. There are hazards inherent in every position, but I maintain this army cannot quit Maryland without a fight. The outcome of our struggle is at stake, sir, and you will recall what our friends in Fredericktown said, that Maryland will rise if we prove our ability to defeat the enemy north of the Potomac. Lee paused, waiting for a moment for old Jack to comment. Then he added, General, I believe this army has within its grasp an opportunity to win the war. We have sacrificed too much not to take it. Jackson nodded at this. Yes, sir. I proposed something similar before more than a year ago. After a moment deep in thought, he looked up. I believe we should fight here, General Lee, and with your permission, I'll return to my command. There is much to do if I am to get my men up quickly. Longstreet shook his head, a bitter scowl on his face. The thought of the two most aggressive generals in the Confederacy putting the army in peril confounded him. Good, said Lee, gratified that Jackson did not share Longstreet's objections. We must wait for Stewart's report before knowing precisely where your command should go, he said. I prefer you allow your men to rest until I am sure. Very good, sir, replied old Jack, raising his hand to salute. With your leave, I will return to my command. By all means, said Lee, we will await your arrival. And watching Jackson move off, he resumed gazing to the east. So my apologies for the extended audio book there, but I wanted to show you how you can use novelized history to unpack the events that only a sentence is required in regular history or standard history to describe. I also would ask, does this sound like a reasonable enough interpretation of the events, or am I taking too much license by putting words into the mouths of these men? Critics of the Killer Angels thought Michael Shara did the same thing when his book came out, and they crucified him in the press for it. But I think we've come a long way since then. At this point, I'm going to make what I think some might consider a controversial claim. I would argue that despite the fabricated dialogue and novelized history, there is often not much difference between it and good old capital H history. Some of you may have noticed earlier that I said historians hopefully tell the story conveyed by the facts as accurately as possible. I ask you to think hard about that. How long did lost cause versions of events dominate historical writing about the Civil War, especially about events at Gettysburg? James Longstreet still gets hammered by critics for losing the battle for the South, even though there is considerable evidence that he simply did the best that he could while following Lee's orders. Just read Corey Farr's recent analysis of the subject to see what I mean. Yet lost causers like Jubal Early actively distorted the record to advance their agenda, and that version of the events is the one that's persisted ever since. Early and the other lost causers didn't only distort the truth, they even made things up, such as the claim that Lee ordered Longstreet to attack the federal line early in the morning of July 2nd, 1863, when the evidence shows that he clearly did not. Basically, lost causers fabricated a fact out of nothing to promote a version of events that still dominates what most people think happened. Would you call that history or fiction? I would call it fiction. What about the issue of armed black soldiers fighting for the Confederacy, or the claim that George McClellan always dawdled? The general's reputation has been undergoing a rehabilitation of sorts for 20 years, with the available evidence showing how badly understood his performance in the Maryland campaign really is. One need read only Ethan Raffuse's treatment of Little Mac, or Joseph Harsh's comments about him, or more recently Stephen Stottlemyre's book, Too Useful to Sacrifice, to see that an accurate establishment of the facts is more than justified. And yet the interpretation promoted like McClellan haters like Stephen Sears and Edward Bonekemper remains dominant, despite the inaccuracies and sometimes outright mischaracterizations. I'd argue that on occasion, both men have written fiction while claiming that it's history, and many people believe that it's true. So I ask those of you in my audience to reflect on this. Is capital H history always the story of what happened in the past? If McClellan didn't dawdle after reading Lee's lost orders, but formal histories say that he did, are you reading fact or fiction? If the Army of the Potomac really did suffer supply shortages after the Maryland campaign that McClellan thought were serious enough to keep him from advancing into Virginia, is the characterization of him as slow accurate and justified? In other words, is it a fact? I'm not arguing one way or another. I'm simply asking those willing to listen if H.L. Mencken's oft-quoted characterization of historians as failed novelists might be closer to the truth than many self-appointed keepers of the past are willing to admit. The point is that historians sometimes go too far in making exclusive claims to the truth, just like poor novelists go too far when they handle facts that have been established carelessly. So I submit to you that the genres of novelized history and straightforward scientific history are not mutually exclusive. They're really more similar than you might think. There's strengths and weaknesses to each. The key for those like me writing both is to be careful so that each genre can enhance our grasp of the past and not cloud it up. So, all right, with that, I think it's enough. So let's take the remaining time we have to take a closer look at how 6 days is structured and what you can expect to find in the book. So I've organized it according to a number of historical personalities and one fictional character. There are, of course, the officers who are the leading lights of the Army, and their actions determine the course of events. There are also ordinary soldiers who give a ground's eye view of the events, and also kind of a window into the sacrifices that ordinary soldiers made for their comrades and for their cause. And then the third group, it's really local Marylanders, and they allow me to delve into the experiences of civilians in wartime, and also to explore the connections between the Army of Northern Virginia and the town of Sharpsburg. The main historical personality is, of course, Robert E. Lee. He's really the center of the book. And this is my favorite picture of Lee because if you look really closely, he's actually smiling, which isn't something that we normally associate with Lee. And my portrayal of him is really an effort to humanize the man who's become known as the Marble Man. Some historians have, some of his subordinates condemned Lee for fighting at Sharpsburg, and a lot of historians have looked on the decision as flawed too. But why he made the stand is really a question mark for a lot of people. And I wanted to explore that the potential there, or the possibility to offer possible answers there in my treatment of him in 6 Days in September. So the reasons that we can validate are that he wanted to restore independence and sovereignty to Maryland. Think of his September 8th declaration to the people of Maryland, for example. He wanted to potentially induce Maryland to join the Confederacy. He wanted to supply his army in a state untouched by the war. He wanted to move the war from devastated Northern Virginia to a place that hadn't been wrecked already by the movement of armies across the landscape. And there are other reasons as well. You know, the amount to move his army into Pennsylvania, etc. Now, some other reasons that I go into in the book that are unverifiable, and these are really speculative because Lee didn't talk about them, include winning a victory north of DC in order to influence the 1862 elections in favor of the Peace Democrats, which was just coming up. So if you remember, this took place toward the end of September, third week in September, and then the elections were happening in November. So a major victory north of the Potomac really would have been could have been a turning point for elections. The potential also to win European assistance for the South. Lee, was famous for saying that we have to do this ourselves. We shouldn't count on help from anyone. And that he didn't expect any kind of help from Great Britain or from France. But given that it was discussed a lot in the highest circles of Confederate politics, and that up until the previous June, he had been stationed in Richmond, working closely with Jefferson Davis and others, the war secretary, etc. He must have known that that sentiment was strong among the people who led the Confederacy. There's also personal ambition. This is something that Michael Fellman has gone into, and also Alan Nolan, about his desire to be Lee's desire to be the Confederacy's George Washington. George Washington was someone he really looked up to and he emulated. And so, I speculate that his personal ambition in trying to win the war in this fashion was to be the founder of a new nation and to do it in the field. And then there's also the question of health. So, Lee, once he embarked on when he started the war, he had dark hair and a dark mustache and looked relatively young. And then he went on campaign in West Virginia. And as a result of that, the harshness of the climate, the stress, all of those things, his hair rapidly changed from dark to white. And then he grew out that beard that has become his trademark. And it's very, very almost white. And it got lighter as the war went on. And I can't help but wonder if he wasn't already suffering from kind of the initial stages of heart disease as of the fall of late summer of September 1862, largely because you feel the symptoms often a long time before the disease becomes acute. And it obviously killed him. So I wonder if he didn't feel those things already, especially under the stress of the fighting that happened at Sharpsburg. And then more importantly, and I think this is kind of something that can be inferred from Lee's actions and then also from things that he said earlier in the war especially, and he understood that the South could not win a sustained war and that it needed to win fast. So he's willing to risk, much like he's willing to risk at Gettysburg, he's willing to risk all of those men launching an attack against the Federal center. He's willing to risk his entire army in Maryland in order to try and win a victory north of the Potomac that would allow Maryland, or would enable Maryland to come into the Confederacy, or at least draw people to his banner, and then maybe make the national government sue for peace. The other historical personalities that you'll meet are, of course, James Longstreet. You heard me comment a little bit about him, and the criticism that he makes, or the argument that he makes to Jackson in that little dialogue that I read to you, makes me wonder if there weren't portents of the conflict that later erupts in Gettysburg, or the arguments later erupt in Gettysburg. And so, those of us who read a lot of Civil War history or are familiar with the events will, of course, know that there were already incidents when Longstreet often questioned what Lee was deciding, or decisions that he would make and strategies that he wanted to take and things like that. But to the casual reader, and remember, I'm trying to appeal to that audience as well and get them interested in history so that they'll buy more history books, they might not know that there were really conflicts of approach, not personality, I'd say, but really approach between Longstreet and Lee. So I kind of highlight that a little bit in the book. And there are also tensions between other commanders as well. So Daniel Harvey Hill and Lee, those two got along like oil and water. So there are often little exchanges between them that are less than civil. So there are things like that going on in the background, and that's kind of helped build the drama between the characters, and then also an understanding of who the characters are themselves. Not characters, sorry, the personalities are themselves. Then, of course, Stonewall Jackson, and he plays really an outsized role in the campaign in Maryland. Right from the beginning, Lee allowed him to choose the point where the Army crossed. He allowed him to blaze the trail to Frederick. He allowed him to establish where they were going to camp. He then, of course, sent Jackson to capture Harper's Ferry. And then when Jackson comes back to Sharpsburg after Harper's Ferry falls, he puts Jackson at the point where he knows that the Federals are going to attack. So, Jackson is an extremely important person in the Maryland campaign. His role in the Maryland campaign is almost that of a partner with Lee, and not just a subordinate. And so, he agreed with Lee about the importance of fighting north of the Potomac, even if it was a defensive battle and not an offensive campaign. Moving now to the fictional characters, there's really only one in the book, and that's Gilbert Farney, a man named Gilbert Farney. And these photographs, the one of Gilbert Farney there in the center, and then Billy Dennis next to him, they're not those two individuals. Obviously Farney because he's fictional, but also Billy Dennis. They're simply rebel soldiers who fit the description of what I saw in my mind's eye when I was writing the book. And so I had to find something that, to provide a visual presentation, I had to find something that represented them. Farney represents a kind of an everyman character, and also my presence within the story itself. His personality is a lot like mine. The things that he cares about are a lot of things that I care about and are important to him. So it's really my imposition of my personality into the story. He and the rest of the men from the 6th Alabama, which is the unit that they fight in, were small farmers from northern Alabama near the Georgia line. Farney's a veteran of fighting on the peninsula. He's already lost a lot of friends and is basically alone except for one other man he's served with since the beginning, and then Billy Dennis, who's relatively new. But the other interesting thing is that a lot of men in the 6th Alabama wore coonskin caps as late as the fall of 1862. So, whereas whenever we typically think about Southern soldiers during the war, we think about them wearing either kepis or slouch hats. Well, here we have coonskin caps with the long tails dangling down the back and everything. His friend is a man named Billy Dennis, who I've nicknamed Wheat because he's so thin. And his name does appear on the roster of the 6th Alabama Infantry at the Battle of Sharpsburg at that time. I have no idea what happened to him. There's no record of whether he was killed or wounded or missing or captured or any of those things. But he was a real person, but I've used him to represent bored youth. I don't know if those of you who've read a lot of letters or a lot of diaries from soldiers, and it doesn't matter what war it is, not just the Civil War, but any war, one of the things that motivates a lot of young men to fight is boredom. They are bored with what life has to offer them, ordinary life has to offer them. And they want to live some kind of adventure or see the world or experience the elephant or all of those things. And so they don't want to be left out. And then there's also the sense that, I'm trying to put a little bit more light on myself because I know it's getting dark here. Then there's the sense that a lot of young men who were left behind, who didn't volunteer in the first wave of volunteering in 1861, women pressured them into going to serve. They couldn't get girlfriends unless they served, those kinds of things. So there's a little bit of that going in there too. And he plays a little brother role to Farney because he's a greenhorn. He's never seen combat before. And so, you know, I get to explore the experience of someone who's really new to this and someone who's a veteran, and it makes a nice combination. And it really allows for exploration of their experiences and motivations in the war. So why the 6th Alabama out of all of the units that I could have chosen? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One of them is a hat tip to Michael Shara, because at the Battle of South Mountain, just north of Turner's Gap, the 6th Alabama served on the extreme left of the Confederate line, just like the 20th Maine served on the extreme left of the Union line at Gettysburg. However, unlike the 6th Alabama, the 20th Maine, things didn't go so well for the 6th Alabama compared to the 20th Maine. The 20th Maine only had a couple of regiments to contend with as part of a brigade. The 6th Alabama had roughly an entire division coming at it, and wasn't able to hold its ground against so many men. But like I said, that's a little bit of a hat tip to Shara. But the more important element, or the more important reason, is that they served at the elbow of the line at Bloody Lane, or the Sunken Road. And so I needed characters and personalities, since one of them was a real person and the other one's a character. I needed to represent their experiences at that position. And I have to admit that Gardner's photographs of the dead at Bloody Lane, those men really, I think those men, it's right on the part of the line where the 6th Alabama was stationed, and they've always haunted me. And so I wanted to write something about what that experience must have been like for those men who had to fight for 2.5 to 3 hours in the same position until they were finally overwhelmed. So that's why I chose the 6th Alabama out of all of the other regiments that I could have chosen. There are many worthy ones and very interesting ones as well. In terms of the historical personalities, the local Marylanders, one of them is a man named Captain Franklin Parnum Turner. And if you look over on the right-hand side of the slide and you see that obelisk right there, that's Franklin Turner's obelisk in the Mountain View Cemetery, which is across the road from the Antietam National Cemetery, right off Route 34 as you're coming up into Sharpsburg. When you go into through the Iron Gate, the first obelisk on the right-hand side is Turner's, and that's the picture there. So he's a local Marylander who fought for the Confederate Army, and he really established a connection with the town. And I just happened to stumble on his name in a book that said he had served as a member of Jackson's staff. I never was able to find any documentation that confirmed that, but the book said it was a roster of Maryland officers that served in the Confederate Army. And so, you know, it was good enough for a literary device, to use him as a literary device to establish a connection between the Army of Northern Virginia and the people of Sharpsburg. The photograph in the middle there with the red circle around the buoy, that's the only photograph that I have of Franklin Turner. And that's him, of course, you know, 10 years old or somewhere around there. The facsimile photograph on the left-hand side is really more how I pictured him and how I describe him in the books. Again, he's another one of these anonymous Confederate soldiers whose photographs have survived, but yet we don't know who they are or what their names were. Turner was originally born in Wicomico, Maryland in 1827, and he's a nephew of a man named Reverend Adams, John Alexander Adams, who I'll go into in the next slide. But he studied law at Franklin Marshall College in Pennsylvania, much like Henry Kidd Douglas did. And he moved to Sharpsburg between 1850 and 1855 to live for a time with his father, Reverend Adams, who was the Episcopal minister in the town at the time. And then during that time, while he was there, he met and married one of the Miller daughters. You'll notice I mentioned Sevilla Miller at the beginning. The Miller family was a very important family in Sharpsburg at the time, and we're also generally sympathizers, sympathetic to the South. Not all of them, I'm sure, but at least the ones that I've run across were. So she married Frances Miller. Married Franklin Turner, and then they moved to Ripley, Virginia, which is actually in West Virginia today, in 1856. And that area went almost completely for the Union in that part of West Virginia in the voting that took place during the Virginia Secessionist Convention. And Turner served in the represented his county and his locality at the Secessionist Convention, and he voted for secession. His county and one other county next to them were the only two counties that went for secession, and so they were like an island of secessionist sentiment in the in this sea of blue around them, or of Unionist sentiment around them. So what he ends up doing is he ends up moving his family to Lynchburg. First he moves them to Richmond, but then McClellan's army approaches and he moves them farther west to Lynchburg to keep them out of the war. And he eventually serves in the 36th Virginia Infantry down in the upper valley, in the lower valley, down toward Lynchburg, in that vicinity. But then, like I said, there's this notation that I found that he served on Jackson's staff, and later on he serves with John McCausland and participates in the burning of Chambersburg. So he obviously moved around a bit. It's just a matter of finding the records. The records are really kind of sketchy there. So in 6 days, what I have him doing is coming up from Richmond after hearing that Bradley Johnson is commanding a brigade in Jackson's command, and that he wants to serve with a Maryland officer. So he comes up to serve with Johnson, runs into him in Martinsburg purely by chance, and when Johnson tells him that he's been relieved of command and he's on his way back to Richmond to become provost marshal there. And so because he knows Kid Douglas, Turner asks if he can serve with Jackson, and Jackson agrees with Douglas's endorsement. And he assigns him to the Black Horse Troop, which is Jackson's escort, in part to give him an assignment and something to do, but also in part to have those guys who we really trust keep an eye on him, because he's new. So even though he volunteers and even though he's a Marylander, and Jackson needs Maryland men in his command to help him with liaison with the locals and things like that, he wants to make sure that he keeps him close. So Turner's presence, what he allows me to do is he serves as a courier largely through the attack in the morning of Hooker's attack on the north side of the field. And so he witnesses a lot of the action that's going on up there north and in the West Woods. So it allows me to tell the story through Jackson's command through his eyes and what he sees. And that so that gives me a presence on the ground along with Douglas himself. Concerning Adams, John Alexander Adams, he was Franklin Turner's uncle, and this photograph is allegedly of him, and I've seen it in St. Paul's Episcopal Church, but I'm not sure if it's actually really him. But for all these intents and purposes, it might as well be him. And he married a woman named Mary Ann Ritchie, who was a widow in 1834, and she owned a very large farm down on Harper's Ferry Road, which was originally about 1,000 acres. So very, very, very large. But by the time that she and Adams marry, she sold off a lot of it and only has a few of her slaves left. So they're really are pretty much in debt, and their homestead is on the decline. They both also have malaria, which they contracted in Kentucky in 1845 during a missionary expedition there. And so Adams is a very unusual or an interesting character or personality. his malaria was when it came upon him, it made him very mercurial. So there are times when he would fly into a rage and be extremely violent, and then there are times when he would sink into the depths of depression, and he would be morose, and he would be silent, and sometimes for weeks at a time. So he ended up having to, Marianne, his wife, had to live with this character and this person, and as a result, she developed an opium addiction through the use of laudanum. And believe it or not, I came across all of this story in documents that were filed against Adams when he tried to make sure that in Marianne's will, that he would get the land that they owned, as opposed to her children from her first marriage. And her children from her first marriage hated Adams, and so they fought him. And all of this information came out in these court documents, which I was really fascinated by and found really interesting, because it really created these personalities, or fleshed out these personalities that make the story really provide another dimension to the story. Really interesting story. And St. Paul's Episcopal Church is, of course, important for having served as a hospital. And the bell tower was also used as an observation post. Some of the roof tiles and the roofing was damaged by federal artillery fire. But the church also, I go to church there, and every Sunday when we go, especially a few years back, we had September 14th, the day of the fight at South Mountain, fell on a Sunday, just like it did during the fighting in 1862. And Adams' name is on the window, the stained glass window right behind me. And so it just made me wonder, what was it like in that church at the time when the fighting was going on. And so, with that kind of notions, I found it really inspiring. And so that's why I wanted to make sure that I included Adams in it. He was just too interesting a character, or too interesting a person not to include, especially because he was Franklin Turner's uncle. I mean, I couldn't ask for a better way to weave, the local history into the story. So wrapping up, Mike asked me to put some information here as to where you might be able to buy the book. There are a number of places. There are signed book plate copies available at savasbeatty.com. You can give them a call, or you can order on their website. Those are the prices right there of the hardcover and the paperback. There's also an audio book, which is read by a man named Edison McDaniels, and he does a far better job than I did. He's got a very interesting voice and a very interesting cadence, so I highly recommend that. You can also get all these books, versions of the book, at Amazon.com, or you can contact me. My email address is right there, and we can arrange for me to sign and inscribe copies, which then I can send with shipping and handling being paid. But we can work it out through PayPal or check or cash. I also maintain a website where I have a blog, and I also post essays occasionally on subjects that are of interest to me. So you can see the address down below, where you can the URL down below where you can visit. And there's one thing I would really appreciate, is that if anyone, as a result of hearing this, is interested in the book and decides that they want to buy it, if you could leave a review on Amazon, it really helps a lot. We authors, we're desperate for people to give us feedback on our work, and then also to help others, to guide others to whether or not they should be reading a certain book and what they can expect from it. So that would be appreciated. And then the last thing I'd like to do is to also just show you some other projects that I've been working on. So the sequel to 6 Days in September, lest you think that I am some kind of a neo-Confederate, that I'm not. The sequel, following the Union Army of the same period, is called The Guns of September, and that's coming out this summer. probably toward the end of July, maybe beginning of August. That's what the tentative date is right now. And it takes the exact same approach for the Union Army as I took for the Confederate Army, in that I focused on George McClellan and Hooker and Burnside and other senior commanders. What a viper's nest that is of personalities, in terms of politics and people not getting along. Captain George Custer is featured in the book as well as a member of McClellan's staff. And he plays the Franklin Turner character, basically. So he's the eyes and ears of McClellan during the fighting on the north side of the field with Hooker's command in the morning. So, you know, he really plays my eyes and ears in the field. And then there are also personalities and characters who are fighting men from the 23rd Ohio and from the 123rd Pennsylvania. The 23rd Ohio, of course, fought on the very far left under Rutherford B. Hayes in the Battle of South Mountain. And then also they fought on the left during Burnside's attack at the end of the day on September 17th. And the 123rd Pennsylvania is a very interesting story because they those men went into they'd been mustered in for 3 weeks, had almost no drill. Large regiment. I think it was 900 men in the regiment, almost all of them green, except they had an experienced commander. And they end up making the farthest penetration of Confederate lines back behind the Dunker Church during the Battle of Sharpsburg. And then, of course, get hit by that torrent of Confederate counterattacks that came from McLaws and Walker and Anderson, and get pushed out of the West Woods. But they're a fascinating story of those men. And then the other thing I'd like to bring your attention is this essay down at the bottom on the right-hand side. It's a digital essay in Kindle and Nook formats. It's 85 pages with 7 high-definition and full-color maps. And it's probably the most fully documented history or story of McClellan's handling of the lost orders when he got them on September 13th. And I think that, we're hoping that we'll get a presentation on this at some point coming up here with one of these virtual presentations that Mike's putting together, but we'll have to see about that. And that's only $3.99 at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. So with that, I'll leave this up here and I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you very much.